Welcome back to another episode of the VIA podcast dedicated to exploring the American West. I'm Michelle Donati.
And I'm Mitty Hicks.
Mitty, I don't know about you, but when I'm planning a trip, I plan it around food. In fact, I just got back from Alaska and got to try Alaska salmon, and it was phenomenal.
Oh, absolutely. I always have food at the top of my to-do list when I go anywhere.
In every episode so far this season, I feel like food has always come up. Today, though, we are talking to probably the foodie that we have yet spoken with on the podcast.
Okay, well, I'm super excited because I'm always hungry.
Our guest today is Giselle Kennedy Lord, who was born and raised in Los Angeles, but currently living in Portland. And her work has been inspired by the landscape, culture, and people who make great meals.
She's the co-author of the Ark of Taste, delicious and distinctive foods that define the United States.
This is someone who is a 2024 James Beard Award finalist. She spent a decade working as a documentary videographer, specializing in food and agriculture before earning a master's degree in gastronomy.
And unfortunately, tomatoes are her favorite fruit, which is something I cannot relate to. Giselle Kennedy Lord, welcome to the VIA podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and talk to you too.
Giselle, Mitty told me that you are a Snoop Dogg fan.
Huge. You read my bio.
I told Michelle you are so West Coast that is like,
love it.
I have so many questions.
So there's some dead giveaways there. I grew up in Southern California. I'm like, well, I'm like almost 40, so I'm like Snoop Dogg's young generation.
His performance at the Super Bowl is probably my all-time favorite halftime show.
That's true.
Actually, I went to school in San Francisco. I was just recounting this to someone. I took my now husband to see Nas. I got these like tickets on Craigslist, and he's a big fan. And I'm like, I like Nas. I enjoy it. And then it was a tiny venue, pretty small for somebody like Nas. And then somewhere in the midst of the concert, he's like, well, my friend's here. And then out comes Snoop Dogg with like 8 other people.
Oh.
It's a really small venue. I was like, oh man, this is my dream come true. That's the one time I saw him like unexpectedly. Really, I mean, he was like right there. And I was like, wow.
Do you dance harder for food or Snoop Dogg?
This is a reasonable question. It depends on the context.
Have you made anything from his cookbook?
No. I know. I'm like, there's this whole kind of like hip hop turned cookbook writers. I'm like, I love this.
Oh, we know.
This shift here. I'm like curious to explore, but I haven't.
This is not a podcast about Snoop Dogg, but
sometimes I do cook too, that genre. 5 classes to plan.
We're in good company.
Absolutely. And I'll just put a little nerd fact in here, which I have a degree in gastronomy, and one of my favorite classes in doing that degree was food science, which you think like, oh, this is like the chemistry of food. But what we really covered in that class was the 5 senses and how much all 5 of them have to do with how your experience of what you're eating. And music is huge. I mean, in some of the most well-reputed restaurants in the world, those playlists are very, very carefully curated and set up because it has a lot to do with how much you're enjoying what you're eating. So if we talk about road trips and stopping here on the Washington coast and like, ooh, what are you listening to on your way to go get those oysters or whatever it is, it has a lot to do with it.
I want to hear all of that.
We want to hear it.
Yeah. We want to hear what you're listening to when you go to get these yummy things. But right off the bat, I have to ask, why are tomatoes your favorite fruit?
Oh, well, this is a good question. I love talking about tomatoes because I think it's like asking a filmmaker what their favorite movie is. And I have a distinct memory of the first time I tasted like a vine-ripened heirloom tomato that was kind of warm from the sun. And I had this moment in which I understood the way something grows, the way it lands on my plate, it changes the way it tastes. The larger American population grows up with grocery stores and you get one kind of banana, you get 2 kinds of apples, you get 1 kind of tomato, maybe 2, that we don't really kind of grasp that there's so much variety in the food world. And so tomatoes were that for me. I mean, I garden a lot. I grow a lot of tomatoes and they're very satisfying to grow. I put lebne on it because I grew up in a Lebanese household and lebne is sort of staple food for me. And that I could eat that every day in the summertime.
Oh, that sounds so good.
I'm not judging you, but I find that tomatoes are my least favorite fruit. But it does feel like when I travel, I will eat more tomatoes and there is a distinct taste. So is it safe to say that a tomato really inspired this love for food and gastronomy that you have?
Yeah, I think that is safe to say. And I always like kind of enjoy this challenge if you and I were out in the world together to be like, okay, let's find the tomato that will change your mind. Plus, we, for some reason, at least my parents' generation is very committed to putting tomatoes in the fridge, which is never, don't put your tomatoes in the refrigerator. Leave them on the counter, eat them.
Right.
Oh, I put my tomatoes on the counter, so I am good there. You've mentioned your parents and that you grew up in a Lebanese household. And so I imagine that you get a lot of your influence from that upbringing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that as I've gotten older, I've recognized sort of the two sides of that, which is my dad grew up in San Francisco. My mom is from Beirut, cooked Lebanese food very, very well, is also a product of sort of the convenience food era. So it was this toggle between a whole day of cooking stuffed grape leaves that are hand rolled and the whole house smells like them, or fish sticks for dinner from the freezer to the oven. You know, it was a juxtaposition, absolutely. And my dad is always hunting for, he like has these little holes in the wall that, you know, whatever. I don't love that phrase, but he's like, there's this particular black mole burrito at this Oaxacan restaurant in Lamita, like around the corner. You know, he knows where that is. And so I think my inclination to seek good food comes from him. And I think he also really appreciated great flavor. He's a fisherman. He loves seafood. And so he was just like always asking his friends.
And decide if he liked it.
He's quite critical. It's hard to get 5 stars from my dad.
Oh, does he give your food 5 stars?
Yeah, he does love my cooking.
Oh, good.
I get the seal of approval.
So next podcast, we'll be in your kitchen.
Sure.
Listening to Snoop Dogg.
Yes.
Like my dad will be like, turn that off. I can't hear you. Mostly. That's my dad's.
You've been quoted as saying food culture is our culture. And I feel like it translates so well into travel. And so you are the perfect person to talk about best places to eat, especially in the West. So I'd love to start in your backyard, so to speak, with the Fruit Loop, what it is and where it is in Oregon in particular.
Because it's not the cereal or candy you're thinking of.
Yeah. I lived in the Columbia River Gorge for over a decade, which is an hour east of Portland. So it's a more rural landscape. And it takes you through this really beautiful part of the Hood River Valley. So it kind of sinks before it goes up into the mountain. The loop is really just a reference point to like, okay, you'll end up back in Hood River at the end of your drive, hopefully.
It is my favorite place in the West, and I can't believe I've never heard of the Fruit Loop.
Oh, good. You've probably been on the Fruit Loop without sort of knowing this name. Driving along the roads that are littered with orchards, which is what the Fruit Loop is kind of a circular route that you can take wherein you will find many you-pick farms. You can get cherries, peaches, apples, pears, blueberries, strawberries along that route. I love that you've been there and you love it. It's undeniably gorgeous. The Oregon and Pacific Northwest growing season is bountiful and like deep and colorful. And I think that was the thing. You're like, the variety of stuff here is astounding. I have access to everything I want. Albacore tuna from the coast. And then this wide array of fruit, which is the freshest, most delicious fruit I've ever had. And there's something in every season, maybe between April and October, I'll say. There's a whole cherry blossom festival. It's just beautiful flowers and the whole landscape just kind of like goes poof and it's all white and pink and really, really beautiful.
Sounds so beautiful.
Yeah. And for much of the drive, you'll be looking at the mountain either ahead of you or behind you. It's orchards, it's mountain, it's vineyard.
So food and views is what I'm like kind of gathering.
Yeah. And wine.
If we had a day to spend there, what would you take us to?
Yeah, I think that Kiyokawa Orchards is a wonderful stop along the loop. It's right off of a little tiny town called Parkdale. Very charming. There's a little railroad stop there. You can do these fun, very kid-friendly, not super long train rides. They also go into Hood River. There's a holiday train. There's stuff throughout the entire summer. You can do Mother's Day brunch on that train, that sort of thing. And Parkdale has a little brewery and a little grocery store and a couple spots for lunch. So it's a good place to kind of go in and out of if you're on the loop. And Kiyokawa has a farm stand. It's a really wonderful family. They've had this land for quite a while. And the reason I love them so much, aside from I did actually get married in one of his orchards.
Oh.
Yeah. But the farm stand has so many varieties of apples and you can sample them. You can take bites. You can live your best life in this farm stand. I remember this very, very well because I was floored. I had no idea this kind of variety existed in the fruit world. I was 24 or something and I was just like, I don't understand what I'm looking at. It tastes fantastic. What wizardry is this, folks?
What wizard?
And so that was kind of my first introduction to them. So super worth a stop at the farm stand.
So it's exclusive, but not expensive.
Right. No, you can, it'll be probably cheaper than the grocery store to buy 10 pounds of apples at a farm stand than it will be if you go to the store, and they'll be better apples.
And fresher.
And you can taste 10 of them and pick your favorite. What could be better?
I'm going fall for Oregon. I was there fall last year and it was incredible. The only thing is I didn't make it to any vineyards. So are we going to any vineyards or wineries on our You Pick tour while we're in Oregon?
Yeah, I think I want to mention one place that I really has my heart in the Columbia Gorge, and it is out in Mosier. So it's not quite on the Fruit Loop. It's 5 miles east of Hood River,
okay,
which is where the Fruit Loop starts. It's called Analemma, and it is a vineyard, and they make beautiful wine. And you can sit in the vineyard and look out over that valley, which I've never been to Tuscany, but in my mind, that's what it looks like. You're just looking at vineyards and green, like patches of grapes. But the other thing I really appreciate about them is they are maintaining and growing some cherry trees. There's a particular variety of cherry that they have. There's only about 200 acres still in cultivation in the world. And I think 180 of them are in the Columbia Gorge.
Whoa.
It's all there. It's called the Black Republican Cherry. It's a very interesting story. You can read about it in the book. But they took on this vineyard and this land, and they kept a lot of those heritage varieties, and they are still growing them, and they're slow food folk, and their wine's delicious, and it's a really wonderful stop. So do the Fruit Loop, grab some dinner, head up to Analemma to get a glass of wine, and a really, really delightful view, and visit and picnic, and
kind of sounds like such a lovely day. Sign me up.
Okay.
Let's go.
That's what the Ark of Taste book is really about. We profiled 70 plus different varieties of food, and kind of the place where they now thrive in the United States is often not the place where they're from. A lot of things came from other continents entirely, from South America, from Africa. That's a big part of what the Ark of Taste is about, is to acknowledge the people who brought those foods here. And that's why I travel to eat, because I think you're getting food from your local ag world, and that food's going to be super fresh and the most tasty.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because one of the things I wanted to know is, when you travel, how do you seek out local food experiences?
What I'm looking for, even just kind of doing research on restaurants, I will go to a restaurant's Instagram account, because often that's where you can see like, oh, today's special is this because we just got fresh strawberries in.
Oh.
They'll put a picture of the thing that might not last too long, but will get people excited. And the thing that doesn't last too long is strawberries have a fairly short season. You want to eat them right away. And so if you have a strawberry shortcake on your menu in June, then I might want to visit your restaurant, and it's not there all the time. Then when it comes to the menu itself, people have a tendency to reference Portlandia with me a lot when I say a thing like this, which for the reference I haven't actually watched. But I will look for a menu that names its farms or the varieties of food. To me, that means that you're getting in season, local, obviously fresh, really fresh and tasty food. And again, it always comes back to flavor. That's what people are looking for. I think that the link that I hope to make in all of these like conversations and in the book and the work that I do is, what's good for the environment is good for us, both health-wise, but also it tastes better. And working with local farmers is extra work. And so oftentimes it will cost a little more. We have to embrace that, because it just takes more work to receive 8 different orders than one truck coming in and dropping everything they're going to feed you.
So I'm curious about oysters on the West Coast.
Excellent, because I love seafood.
I lived in New Orleans, so oyster culture was raw and char grilled.
Yeah.
So oysters and seafood, they are synonymous in your mind with what part of the West Coast?
I hesitate to say this because I'm an Oregonian these days, but the Washington coast is your quintessential, I think, oyster experience. And Seattle, wonderful city to visit, a wonderful place to eat. You will not be hard pressed to find great oysters in Seattle, in and around Seattle. I mean, throughout the Puget Sound. I think that Taylor Shellfish is a multi-generational operation up in Washington. They have a few locations in Seattle, but they have this one very idyllic, very cool location in Samish. I don't actually know if I'm saying that right. That's what the town is called, Samish, Washington. But it's about an hour and a half away from Seattle. If you want to go to Taylor on the coast, you need a car. You'll drive on Chuckanut Drive, which is the thing about the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, is very much the same that I was surprised by after growing up in Los Angeles. Is the first time I went to the coast out here, we were driving with my sister-in-law and we're just surrounded by trees, forest, like dense forest. And then all of a sudden the forest broke and we're at the coast because the forest runs right up to the ocean.
Oh, that's so beautiful. It sounds so beautiful.
So we have all these cliffs, and Chuckanut Drive kind of does this little loop through this particular area of Washington that's really, really beautiful. And then you'll land what feels kind of in the middle of nowhere. There's really nothing else around, but they have oyster beds and they have their boats there. And I think a lot of their seafood kind of comes through this spot. So they decided, why not set up shop here? And they have an excellent wine list. But you get to sit outside on like a barrel and a couple stools and get 24 oysters and a bottle of sparkling white wine. And it's really just kind of salty and super clean air. The Olympia oyster is kind of the crown jewel for the Pacific Northwest because of its history. It almost went extinct. It's a little hard to find because their populations aren't huge. Taylor Shellfish often has them when they're in season, which changes a little bit depending on the winter and the climate. But it's summertime essentially. And they're tiny little oysters. They're pretty sweet as oysters go. I prefer tiny oysters.
It's kind of hard to picture a sweet oyster.
Yeah, it's from those like kind of those waters, and it's a different family of oyster. That is one of few oysters that are really native to this Pacific coast. And the native people of the West Coast are obviously the original stewards of this oyster. I mean, they were eating it long before any of us knew anything about it. And so they have been involved in keeping it thriving as well, very importantly involved, because they know those waters best, they know those creatures best, and it's an important part of their foodways. I think it's just always something to keep in mind.
Is there a specific way you should eat it? I'm thinking about this because in New Orleans, we did lemon juice, the hot sauce, and then, of course, there was char grilled with cheese and bread. How do we eat this oyster?
I would just eat it straight up. I think a couple drops of lemon juice are great. But again, it's sort of uniquely slightly sweet. And so it doesn't need too much.
Okay.
And I'm not sure the ollie, which is what it's often called, would go super well with hot sauce because of that slight sweetness. When I eat an oyster, I want to be like, I want the world around me to be a little bit salty, and very much like moving water kind of thing. I think like we were talking about before, it has a lot to do with your experience. How fresh is it? Are you getting a good little...
All of your senses, right?
Yeah.
Not just the taste, but every other sense. And that's a part of the science of food, or your experience in gastronomy, right?
Yes, absolutely. And like, what kind of music is Taylor Shellfish playing in their Seattle restaurant? I would imagine it sort of transport you to their sort of coastal sources for the food they're serving. That's kind of my goal, is to like do it just enough looking around before you travel to say, what should I be looking for when I'm in this place? Or like, what are the farms growing? And then look for that on the menu. And if we're calling out things that do particularly well in different regions, it often ends up being an animal or a fish, because obviously they're pretty particular to those zones. Best friend moved to Montana a couple of years ago, and everywhere we went, there were bison burgers on the menu. I also like calling out bison because it's a resurgence, I think, for good reason. This is also an animal that was cultivated, I said the right word, by Native people. And so it's a good opportunity to seek out Native-owned restaurants. They have this heritage knowledge. I think heritage goes into not just the food itself, but how it's prepared, which is why I say food culture is culture, because slow food has a bit of a moniker, which is a little complex, but the idea of eat it to save it. So if we can make a way for people who are raising bison to continue to raise bison, there's a pretty strong argument for that because the populations on ranches are growing so much, and we want these animals on our land. They're good for our land. They're good for us. It's an important connection to native foodways for native people.
If you're visiting a native-owned restaurant, look for bison on the menu.
Yeah, I think, and particularly if you're in the mountains regions, and if you're in the native-owned restaurant in the Pacific Northwest, you should be looking for fish.
Okay.
You know, it kind of depends.
Look for the local. Look for what's local.
Yeah, I mean, they're the original local foodies. It's like they ate what was around them. And I think that sometimes we tend to separate the two, the culture of food with sort of the ecology of food, to sort of the environment part of that. And I think that's why we look to native communities for that, because they don't separate that. They never have. You know, that's obviously they're one and the same. And I love that slow food is able to tell that story. And I love that I was able to be part of sort of communicating those stories to people by way of the book.
Can you tell me a little bit about your work with Slow Food USA and how that led to your work or inspired your work for the Ark of Taste?
Yeah, absolutely. The Ark of Taste is a project of Slow Food International. The thing I love about Slow Food is it's really about merging culture, landscape, and people. You know, all of those things are equally important. So that's why the Ark of Taste focuses on, well, how did those fish pippers get to the South? They came with people who were brought there by force, you know, and it's like, we have to tell these stories because they're really important stories to remember, to record. There are chapters throughout the country, Slow Food Portland, Slow Food Seattle, or wherever you are, and they will focus on that local and regional food system and food culture. Everything we eat has a story, and it's largely about people.
Is there any particular special food experience that you've had when eating local food, or one that you hope to have?
The Southwest is my kind of dream, top of the list road trip, going through Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, both for like, it's gorgeous landscapes, but also chilies. There's a pretty strong contingent down in New Mexico, and they're proud of their chilies, and rightfully so.
I'm so excited to get into peppers and chilies, because that is, now we're in my territory.
Now you're in your zone.
We're in Michelle's. This is what she knows. She knows her chilies and peppers.
You know your chilies.
Oh.
Yeah.
In Arizona, I look forward every year to hatch chili season, which happens in New Mexico, but we get, and they roast hatch chilies here, and it smells so good. And you can get hatch chilies in everything. It makes me so happy. And they have a very mild flavor, at least when I've had them. But on your list, it's the Chimayo chili?
Yeah, I'm like not even sure why I got a little bit enamored of this one particular chili.
Well, I'm like, is there a chili I haven't tried? Because I'm adding that to my list.
I think I actually found a seed packet that was it was called the New Mexico chili or something like that. And I think it was Chimayo. And the Chimayo kind of came up as this sort of classic New Mexico chili. And I remember speaking to one friend of Slow Food down there, and she said, oh, all of the households out here, at least like probably if you live in any sort of agrarian area, you're going to find a jar of dry Chimayo flakes on the table. It's like salt on the table, Chimayo on the table. And so I think we don't quite give enough credence to what the soil and the particular landscape is doing to the vegetables or fruits or whatever's growing there. I mean, there's a whole different symphony of nutrients and stuff in that soil that is going to give slightly different flavor. Also, long, super hot days are going to change the way a chili sort of manifests.
Like Michelle in Arizona, I'm sure she's getting the smoky.
We're just a little more, we're just smoky here.
You're just smoky vibes.
It is hot.
But it sounds like you can take the spice, though. She said the ear ringing. I'm like, Michelle, we need to talk about what you're into.
You know it's a good spicy pepper when you get a little ear ringing. I have had some peppers, though, that are so spicy that like you have to like drink a whole glass of something to get the spice out. And then you don't enjoy it as much. So
Oof.
I like the flavor of being able to sit and enjoy it more than the heat, but I don't mind a little bit of heat.
It can be your central flavor, but you don't want it to floor somebody. But I think that, and to me, it just feels like that's the thing in that zone. I'm just very interested in the Southwest in general. You know, much of that area basically was Mexico. And so a lot of those food traditions and agricultural traditions stayed or came up that way. And now they're held dear. And it's because they grow best there. And that's my argument is go eat the thing that grows the best it can be in that place, which for the Southwest is chilies.
I was going to say, and especially as a chili connoisseur, one of the places on my list to visit is Las Cruces, New Mexico, to go to the Hatch Chili Festival.
Yeah, I really want to go.
Which is every year around Labor Day. Like that is, I can't even tell you, as far as a food destination, going to a Hatch Chili Festival is definitely a square on my bingo card, on my 2024 bingo card.
It's just the way your face lit up about a chili festival.
Amazing. Yeah, I'm in.
Let's go. I can meet you there. What are we going to listen to, Giselle? What are we listening to as we?
Oh, this is great. I mean, when we were talking earlier, I was talking about cooking. When I'm cooking, I often listen to Latin music, like I have like Julieta Venegas and like kind of pop-ish Latin music a little bit. Natalia Lafourcade is an artist that I really enjoy. And I'm like, I don't know, something about being in New Mexico and feels like that would be the right vibe.
Yes.
Eating chilies, listening to, I think.
Sounds pretty good to me.
Julieta Venegas might be from Tijuana or something. I maybe I'm saying that wrong, but, that is what I like to cook to often and what I enjoy. Like, if you're having fun, it's easy background music to kind of keep the energy up.
Now, thanks to you, I'm going to leave this podcast hungry. So
yes. I think seeking your next best bite will take you to wonderful places.
I love that. That's such a great, seek your next best bite. Giselle Kennedy Lord, thank you for being on the VIA podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Coming up on the VIA podcast, stories from AAA members. We'd like to take a moment to say thanks to all those AAA members and future members that are listening to the VIA podcast and have shared their travel stories. One story we've heard from members is how they've been able to use their AAA roadside benefits when traveling as the passenger in a friend's vehicle. That's right. AAA members can use their own AAA membership in someone else's car to receive roadside help. And that right there helps explain why AAA is America's membership. So, if you're not yet a member, simply visit AAA.com and check out the membership plans.
Hey, Mitty, after talking to Giselle, I don't know about you, but I'm hungry.
I'm always hungry.
I'm talking about being hungry for member emails, and we have one.
What, and is this email going to make us hungrier? I don't know if that's a good thing.
Well, we have Brenda D. Rees from Utah, and she writes, every year I recommend the Salt Lake Greek Festival, which is held annually on the second weekend in September. In the years when I have lived far away, my friends whom I introduced to the festival would call and brag about being there. I was always very jealous that I couldn't be there too.
I feel like I would do this to you with that chili festival that you want to introduce me to so bad.
That would be so mad.
What if I get there before you?
Oh, but just buy some chilies and send them my way. Send for me? I don't know. Thank you so much, Brenda, for writing in. Greek food is some of my favorite food. And so I can only imagine the FOMO you feel when your friends rub it in your face that they're there and you're not. Love your comments, questions, and especially your stories about travel in the West. Send us an email at viamail@viamagazine.com. Again, that email is viamagazine.com. You can also leave us a voicemail at 415-475-9350. Again, that phone number is 415-475-9350.
And don't be shy. You may hear your voicemail played on the podcast.
The VIA podcast is hosted by Mitty Hicks and Michelle Donati. That's me.
Produced by Whitney Fanoof, editor-in-chief of VIA, Katie Henry, managing editor of VIA, and editorial consultant April Kilcrease, alongside Dave Beasing and Jason Jackson of Sound That Brands.
Thanks for listening. If you like what you heard, don't forget to follow and subscribe to the VIA podcast. That way, you'll never miss an episode. Discover more places to travel in the West at AAA.com/VIA. VIA Magazine is published by AAA Mountain West Group.
The views and opinions expressed by podcast speakers and guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of AAA Mountain West Group or its personnel.